This footage captures an F-16 slicing across the sky under the control of a decorated demo pilot, rehearsing a high-speed maneuver for Poland's biggest air show of the year. The energized crowd cheered from below, phones raised to the sky, recording every single moment of an event meant to be a national milestone. At that point, no one knew that just seconds later, this same flight would turn into a truly horrifying spectacle, and end in a way no one could have ever imagined. But first, as always, viewer discretion is advised. On August 28, 2025, Airshow crews were finalizing preparations for one of the most significant aviation events in Central Europe, Airshow Random 2025, a massive event set to draw tens of thousands. It was meant to showcase Poland's military aviation might. That evening, aircraft from across NATO were scheduled to perform, but none more anticipated than Poland's own F-16 Tiger demo team, led by its star pilot, Major Maciej Krakowian. At 37 years old, he was the face of Polish aerial precision, a combat-tested aviator with more than 1,000 hours in the F-16, an instructor at the 31st Tactical Air Base, and a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. Only weeks earlier, he had returned from England, where his performance was voted Best Flying Display at the 2025 Royal International Air Tattoo. But August 28th wasn't just another flight. It was Polish Aviation Day, a holiday commemorating the country's proud Air Force tradition, born from the daring victories of Polish fighter aces in 1920 and celebrated each year as a national day of pride. Therefore, for Major Krakowian, it was a chance to fly his signature maneuvers before a home audience on such an important day for the entire nation. That evening, he departed from his base in Poznań, and by 7:13 p.m. checked in with Radom Sadkow Tower under the call sign Tiger 01. Yet instead of being cleared immediately, a voice crackled back. Tiger 1, do not fly above flight level 120. In aviation language, that meant stay below 12,000 feet. Moments later, without warning, another aircraft, a Korean-built FA-50, also rehearsing for the show, passed dangerously close. Startled, Krakowian keyed his radio. Tower, are you aware that an F-50 just passed flight level 100 right next to me? But the radio stayed silent on his end, and instead of responding to Krakowian directly, the tower operator mistakenly gave his reply to the FA-50 pilot, confirming information that should have gone to the F-16. The tension in Krakowian's voice escalated, and he repeated, sharper this time. They just passed our holding altitude, about 1,000 feet from me. Ultimately, it took nearly a full minute before the mistake was corrected, and the FA-50 was cleared away. Finally, the tower assured him, the airspace is now yours. But by then, the delay had already taken its toll. And unfortunately, Krakowian's focus, so vital for a flawless routine, had been shaken. Still, at 7:28 p.m., with clearance granted, he began his sequence. The F-16 roared overhead, pulling into polished high G twists, tight rolls, and aggressive bursts of afterburner, maneuvers choreographed to display the raw power of Poland's frontline fighter. After several warm-up passes, the jet climbed steeply, banking left, then inverted, belly to the sky, to set up a dramatic split S, a maneuver that drops the aircraft into a steep dive, trading altitude for speed before leveling out low across the runway. To the crowd below, the spectacle was breathtaking. But within seconds, something looked extremely wrong. The jet wasn't leveling. Instead, it pitched nose down, still accelerating, dropping at more than 9,000 meters per minute. Excited cheers gave way to silence. A firefighter watching from the edge of the airfield whispered under his breath, "Pull up, pull up." Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, Krakowian was no doubt doing exactly that, desperately pulling the side stick with all his strength. However, at that speed and at such a low altitude, recovery was nearly impossible. And at 7:30 p.m., sharp, the tail of the F-16 clipped the runway in a burst of sparks. Half a second later, the nose slammed down. The jet erupted into a violent fireball, fuel tanks rupturing, sending flaming debris hurtling hundreds of meters. In an instant, the 15-ton machine became a comet of fire and twisted metal, leaving a charred scar more than 300 meters long across the runway. Emergency crews, already on standby, rushed forward within 2 minutes, battling flames as ammunition detonated in sharp bursts. At the same time, all eyes turned skyward in desperate hope of seeing a parachute, a chance that the legendary pilot had ejected in time. But by 7:40 p.m., when the flames were finally beaten back, that hope was gone, since Major Krakowian's lifeless body was found inside the shattered cockpit. News of the tragic crash spread within minutes. That night, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk and Defense Minister Władysław Kozyniak-Kamysz arrived at Radom, standing quietly amid the wreckage. On social media, they called it a great tragedy for the Polish Air Force. At Krakowian's home in Poznań, the next morning's roll call was held in silence. His name was spoken once, then never again. Back at Radom, investigators picked through the wreckage. They recovered the flight data recorder and unused ACE's 2 ejection seat and every major fragment of the airframe. At that stage of the investigation, nothing pointed to a mechanical failure, and the F-16 was described as fully operational. Therefore, attention turned instead to human factors. The controlled confusion, the rehearsal delay, and the pilot's mental state after a near miss with another aircraft. Investigators questioned whether the altitude for that barrel roll had been calculated too low, or if the maneuver itself had been rushed after the holding pattern incident. And while those answers were still to come, the remainder of the airshow was immediately canceled. In its place, a memorial wall appeared outside the base, covered by flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes. One message read simply, "You inspired us. Fly high." In a single evening, Poland lost its most accomplished demo pilot. However, the disaster could have been far worse, since even in his final seconds, Krakowian kept the jet aligned with the empty runway, never veering toward populated areas. In doing so, he became the only victim of his crash, and likely spared hundreds of lives on the ground. Tragically, the same could not be said for our second case, a catastrophe remembered as one of the deadliest civilian airshow disasters in U.S. history. On September 16, 2011, the late afternoon sun cast a golden haze over the Nevada desert as thousands of spectators filled the grandstands at Reno Stead Airport. Laughter echoed across the tarmac. The smell of barbecue lingered in the air, and vintage warbirds thundered overhead, skimming just meters above the ground in what was billed as the world's fastest motorsport, the Reno Air Races. Among the contenders that day was a sleek silver aircraft slicing the air at nearly 850 kilometers per hour, an aggressively modified World War II-era P-51 Mustang named the Galloping Ghost. And inside the cockpit sat its 74-year-old pilot, Jimmy Leeward, a veteran aviator, Hollywood stuntman, and lifelong thrill-seeker with more than 13,000 hours of flight time to his name. Leeward had spent nearly 3 decades racing in Reno, but this time felt different. He had poured years into turning the Galloping Ghost into a high-speed monster. Its wings had been clipped down from the original 11.3 meters to just under 9 meters. The signature underbelly radiator scoop had been removed entirely and replaced with a custom boil-off cooling tank hidden in the fuselage. Even the canopy had been shaved down to reduce drag. Meanwhile, inside, nearly every non-essential component had been stripped out, all in the pursuit of speed and victory in the Unlimited Gold Finals, a race that promised not just glory, but a $1 million prize. And on that Friday afternoon, everything looked perfect. The crowds were loud, the engines roared, and the announcer's voice rang out across the field. You have a race. From the start, Leeward played it smart, holding back just enough to conserve momentum, then unleashing the Mustang's full fury at the turns. By the third lap, he had surged into third place, just behind another P-51 known as Voodoo. The two planes tore around Pylon 8, kicking up wake turbulence as they hugged the course at terrifying speed. But then, something went catastrophically wrong. Spectators watched as the Galloping Ghost suddenly snapped upward in a violent, almost vertical climb, then inverted without warning. At first, many assumed it was part of a maneuver. But within seconds, it became clear this wasn't a stunt. The Mustang's nose pitched sharply downward, and the aircraft began hurtling directly toward the grandstands at more than 800 kilometers per hour. In an instant, the silver fighter struck the concrete apron just meters in front of the VIP box seats. The plane disintegrated instantly, and since it came in almost vertically, with its full fuel load still intact, the impact itself acted like a bomb. Propeller blades, engine parts, tire fragments, and cockpit debris rocketed outward like artillery, ripping through folding chairs, coolers, and most horribly, people. Suddenly, one man's jaw was severed by a piece of propeller. A woman nearby lost both legs. Another was struck by a large fragment of wing and died on the spot. In that moment, the joyful race atmosphere transformed into something that one witness later described as a war zone. Ultimately, the plane's engine embedded itself in the concrete. The propeller lay 90 meters away, bent and bloodied. Scattered across the site were purses, shoes, and children's toys, mixed in with bolts, aluminum shards, and, in the most haunting detail, fragments of human remains. In the middle of the chaos came the sirens. The announcer's voice crackled through the loudspeakers, pleading for calm and evacuation.
Stay calm. Let the professionals do what they can do. Please step back. We understand your concern.
First responders set up triage zones directly on the tarmac. Meanwhile, a military helicopter that had been on static display only minutes earlier was hastily converted into an emergency medevac and began ferrying the most severely wounded to nearby hospitals. And through it all, one question hung over everyone's head. How could this happen? What no one in the stands had seen, and what would only be confirmed after a months-long investigation, was that Leeward's plane had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure mid-race. It turned out that as part of his radical modifications, Leeward had disconnected the right elevator trim tab. He fixed it in place and relied entirely on a motorized tab on the left side to stabilize the aircraft at high speeds. And during that sudden climb, the left elevator trim tab, a small control surface critical for high-speed stability, tore free from the tail. Furthermore, investigators found that the lock nuts holding it had likely not been replaced since 1985. Worn down by decades of vibration and stress, they eventually failed at the worst possible moment. Therefore, the aircraft pitched violently upward, exposing Leeward to more than 17 Gs, a gravitational force strong enough to knock out even a trained fighter pilot. Witnesses later confirmed that Leeward's head had slumped forward during the climb, suggesting he had blacked out before the plane even began its fatal dive. Worse still, Leeward's extensive modifications had never been formally tested, inspected, or approved by race officials. He had not reported most of the changes to event organizers, nor had he conducted proper high-speed testing. The crash, they concluded, was a disaster just waiting to happen. But the mechanical failure was only part of the tragedy. The layout of the course itself had contributed to the scale of the devastation. Although FAA regulations called for at least 300 meters of distance between spectators and the race line, Reno's layout placed the crowd just 230 meters away, and that 70-meter gap proved fatal, since investigators later concluded that if the grandstands had been positioned further back, the plane might have impacted only empty ground. The final toll was horrific. At least 69 people were injured, many of them gravely. Some lost limbs. Others suffered traumatic brain injuries, deep lacerations, or permanent disfigurement. But most horribly, including Jimmy Leeward himself, 11 people lost their lives in the crash. Among the other victims was 71-year-old Cheryl Elvin, who had made the Reno Air Races an annual tradition with her husband and 2 sons. All 3 men were also injured in the blast. Another victim, 47-year-old Greg Morcom, had brought his father and nephew to the event. His brother Ron, who miraculously escaped injury, later said, "Everyone in our section got hit, except for me." A 22-year-old man named Michael Wogan died instantly. He had come to watch the race with his family just weeks before starting a new job. George and Wendy Hewitt, a Canadian-American couple and longtime aviation fans, also lost their lives that day. George's mother, Rose, later said a heartbreaking phrase about the death of her beloved son. "It was the worst moment of my life. I broke down. It was so hard I couldn't stop. He had such a beautiful life." There were more, and many names never reached the headlines. But the grief was real, and for their families, the pain never faded. In the aftermath, the air races were canceled immediately. The site was shut down, with dozens of lawsuits following, including from the families of victims, survivors who lost limbs, and witnesses who suffered psychological trauma. Eventually, a $77 million compensation fund was established to address the losses. Each year, flowers were placed near the plaque at Reno Stead, honoring the 11 lives lost that day. For the families of the victims, the crash remained a scar that never fully healed. Bill Elvin, who lost his mother and his leg, later said, "How do you protect people from catastrophic events? We have to accept that's how life is." But the catastrophe led to sweeping changes. In the years that followed, safety protocols at Reno were overhauled. Planes with major modifications were now required to undergo strict engineering reviews. Spectator areas were pushed back beyond the 300-meter line. Pilots were trained on G-force awareness. And more importantly, no aircraft would ever again be allowed to compete without proof that every system, even the smallest trim tab, had been properly tested and secured. The The Galloping Ghost's final flight remains the third deadliest airshow disaster in U.S. history, but it was far from the only one. As of 2025, more than 700 documented airshow accidents and disasters have occurred globally since the early 20th century, resulting in over 1,000 fatalities and thousands more injured among performers and spectators. And the numbers in the U.S. alone paint an equally grim picture. From 1993 to 2013, the country recorded 174 aircraft crashes during civilian air events, leading to 114 deaths and 112 injuries. Unfortunately, these two horrifying cases we've covered today are just part of that tragic statistic. Now let me ask you, have you ever attended an air show? And would you still want to after watching this video? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more shocking, real-life stories that might one day make you think twice about what's really happening just overhead.